I'm Tyler Crivella, and this month I'm going to be helping out Equality and Forensics with their Septober, basically their September and October public forum topic lecture. First up, a little bit about me. So currently, I go to the University of Texas at Dallas, and I'm the captain of the Comet Speech and Forensics team. I'm also the current assistant coach at Seven Lakes and Jordan High School. I absolutely love speech and debate. I've been doing it for quite some time now, and I had a wonderful time doing it as a competitor a couple years ago. And now I'm here to do more of it, which I love doing. We're going to get in straight into the PF topic for this month, with some background. Now, because this is a few weeks into the cycle, a lot of the targeting that I'm doing with this lecture is more designed for novices. That doesn't mean that older members and varsity members, those returning to debate, can't engage with this lecture, but I'm going to try to use a lot more simple terms and try to make this a bit of a introductory lecture, especially because this is the first one of the year. So let's begin just with the resolution. The resolution this year, or for this set of months, is the United Kingdom should rejoin the European Union. The UK should rejoin the EU. Thankfully, first, we have should rejoin. Those words tell us the fiat, aka that the affirmative team, for all purposes of the debate, we are assuming that voting for the affirmative means that there is a rejoining that happens. To prove the resolution true, aka the job of the affirmative, is to make it such that this sentence in the act of rejoining the EU is a viable option. The metric that we usually use to evaluate this is some sort of cost benefit analysis. So basically, if there are so many benefits to joining the EU, then of course the EU should do it. But if doing so would also cause some really big impacts, like maybe a pandemic occurs or something, then we probably shouldn't do it. And so that's the sort of framework that we're going to be going into this. But before we get into those common arguments, let's talk about the actors at play. First, the European Union, or the EU, as it's more colloquially known. So the EU is what is oftentimes referred to as a superbloc. It is a very large political institution that was founded in 1993 thanks to a series of treaties. And the EU has been gaining popularity and power over the past few decades, but that strive to become the EU has been starting ever since we saw the world wars at the beginning of the 20th century. World War One and World War Two both took place largely in Europe, and both of them left the European nations very split up and economically divided, having a lot of hardship. And we also saw the Cold War, in which the USSR and the US essentially fought for control of parts of Europe. We had what was called the Iron Curtain, essentially a blockage between East and West Europe that was basically a dividing role across Europe as a whole. The founding of the EU was kind of a response to all of these things breaking the EU up, and was a political movement to bring everything together and to create a block of stability. So there's a couple main ways that the EU does this. The first is politically. By having a single unit to make decisions, it's a lot easier to have federal, or not federal, but a collective decision-making entity that can act as a representative for all of the EU. If you think about the nations of the EU, there's oftentimes very small ones. Even countries such as Germany that are quite large aren't as large as nations such as Russia or China or the US, not just in terms of land mass, but also in terms of economic parity. So it makes sense to have a union of all of these countries coming together to give them the political will and legitimacy to enact ideas on the global population. It basically means it's a lot harder for other entities like the US to throw around little nations in the EU, because now they have to contend with the entirety of this bloc. And speaking of, it's also a large economic bloc. There's a few key ways that this happens. First is mainly through the introduction of things like the single market in the Eurozone. Let's define those terms. First, the Eurozone. If you've heard of the euro, you know what this is essentially. It's basically the area in which the euro is the accepted and default currency that is used. And in order to join the Eurozone, nations have to abide by a series of frameworks. And in fact, nations that join the EU are automatically added into the Eurozone if they meet a series of criteria year after year. Certain nations have had opt-out clauses, one of which is the UK, but other nations currently are actively trying to not reach those guidelines as a means of not joining the euro. And the reason is because being a part of the eurozone means that the European Union as a whole is making decisions about your monetary currency and your monetary policy that other times you would lose. So if you think about the US, we have the Federal Reserve, currently led by Jerome Powell. He makes decisions with a few other people about what the interest rate should be and making those monetary decisions about how much money is in circulation in the US economy. That means that the US has its own control in many ways over how it takes care of monetary policy. If Jerome Powell prints more money, then it makes an inflationary edge in the US's currency, the dollar. With the EU, though, if a country such as Spain wants to have a lower interest rate, it doesn't really get a say in the Eurozone. It gets a few seats, being a slightly and relatively larger nation, but it doesn't get the end all be all say because it's a collective group. Also, we have the single market. This is essentially the idea that when trading between nations inside the EU, it's super easy to do so. You can send goods without paying excessive things like tariffs, which are very popular now, basically trades on or taxes on trades, because the EU is a collective bloc. So once you get in, you're now permanently in there. That means that trade between nations inside, like between Germany and Spain, is way easier and they don't have to pay excessive taxes because they're both part of the single market. That means that it's way easier to trade. Those economies are together, so there's competition between those companies. If one country is doing better in a certain thing, it wouldn't make sense for another country to also have to pay for that. For example, if we have a country that is extremely good at making flowers and a country that really wants flowers every day. Well, if there wasn't a single market, then every day when they import flowers, they would have to pay tons of fees and it would harm the trade that goes on between those nations. But because it's a single market, it's way easier to conduct that. More trade happens, the economy grows, and those sorts of ideas drive the general single market idea. This is also a migratory superbloc, which has been a lot more involved in recent political discussions, specifically in what's called the Schengen zone. This is the idea that once you are inside the EU, you have certain rights to be able to freely move between nations inside it. So, for example, if you're in Germany and you'd like to get to Slovenia, you have to go through Austria. But you can take a train because you're already in the Schengen zone. That means that you don't have to go through excessive passport checks. You don't have to go through extreme customs movements. You don't have to apply for a visa to move between those two because you are guaranteed to have free movement and those free rights. Now, that has caused some issues in recent memory because people are more scared about immigration, and certain nations feel that they might be getting taken advantage of by the system in which people are moving into their nation. For the sake of this debate that you're having, though, and as we'll talk a little bit further, the main issue you should be worried about is the economics of the superbloc. The political aspect is also extremely important, but I would say to start with the economic aspect of learning about the EU. And as I previously said, we're going to move on to the opt-outs. Essentially, whenever the UK was part of the EU, it had created a lot of certain clauses that made it exempt from many policies in the EU. This included the Eurozone. Essentially, the UK, which as we know today still has the pound or the quid in some instances, it was able to live outside the Eurozone. And that wasn't because it did that sort of guideline skirting that some nations are right now to not join the Eurozone intentionally, but rather because in those initial treaties founding this very policy, the UK made themselves a specific way out. We'll talk a little bit later about what that means because now that those policies are off the books, if the UK rejoins, maybe they won't have any more opt-outs. They'd be forced into the Eurozone. They'd be forced into Schengen. They'd be forced into the single market. Speaking of the UK or the United Kingdom, let's start to talk about them now. Currently, the UK is four different nations. In the United States, we call these states. I would say it's a pretty similar division, except there's not as much of a state government as there is in the UK. If you look on the right here, you can see that there's four nations, the England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Together, they form the United Kingdom, like the United States of America. Now, what's interesting though is that the northern sorts of nations, specifically Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted that they did not want Brexit. This was the same with the City of London, which sort of has its own political unit of sorts in the UK. And all three of those large groups voted that they didn't want to leave the EU. So these sorts of areas would be super supportive of rejoining the EU. More so, we can see that the UK has what's called a parliamentary system. This is different than what we have in the US, where we mainly have a two-party rule system and we have a sort of federal system. There's many ways that you can call the US way of living, but think about how in America we've got two main parties. In the UK, there are dozens of parties, some of which only have 1 to 5 members that are actively participating, but they're able to do so because they have a system in which coalitions need to be built. Meaning that in order to roll the government and to pass legislation, you just need a majority by whatever means possible. So oftentimes parties will come together to form little blocks inside their parliament, ultimately getting them over the line to pass pieces of legislation and whatever policy agenda they want. Before Brexit, we saw two main parties, the Conservatives or Tories, sort of the Republican Party of the UK, and the UKIP Party, the United Kingdom Independence Party or UKIP. Those parties together were the right wing of the UK, and they supported and really pushed for Brexit to happen. And then we saw a lot of impacts follow from that. Right now, we're seeing the UK is financially struggling. Now, of course, there's many ways that you can attribute this and to say the causes of the UK's financial struggles are, whether it be COVID or the Russia-Ukraine war or the general slowdown that has occurred following the tariff discussion and sort of the general fears of maybe there being an AI bubble. But one key thing that keeps coming up time and time again is calls that the reason for the UK's economic struggle is because it left the EU. If you remember all those benefits, like the Eurozone and the single market, all of those have gone away. So we might be seeing some interaction with the topic. So speaking of, let's get into the specifics of what happened with Brexit. So we just talked about the right-wing parties in the UK proposed this sort of policy, but let's sort of understand a bit more that caused it to occur. So Brexit didn't just happen in a single year. It was an idea that had been building up for decades on end. In the late 2000, around 2009, we saw the Lisbon Treaty, which was sort of another fuel to the fire, which built up what's called Euroscepticism in the UK. The idea that they shouldn't trust this large authority of the EU to take care of their decisions. The Lisbon Treaty essentially made more power in the hands of the EU, allowing it to have higher decision making and trump a lot of local laws, as well as to have a higher say and higher enforcement in how it enforces regulations. Those sorts of policies have been happening for decades. But once the UKIP party and the Conservatives got into power and really had a big ledge in 2016, they were able to pass through the referendum of 2016. A referendum basically means that the citizens of the UK voted as a single issue to vote on. So instead of going to vote for, like in the US, to vote for the president, imagine if you just voted on one bill. The referendum was basically that, and it was just whether or not the UK should stay in the EU. And by a very slim margin of 52 to 48, more specifically, something like 41 or 51.9 and 48.1, they voted to leave. And thus, over the next 4 years, they went through a very complicated system of trying to work out a deal to have some parts of the UK with the EU. But basically, every demand that the UK put in place was incompatible with staying in the EU. So they would say things like, well, we want to have some of the less economic barriers towards the EU, but we also want our independence. We want to have our own currency and make our own regulations. But those two things are part of the same super block that is the EU. You can't just pick and choose, well, we want this, but not this. So they eventually got to a pretty much no deal system in which they left on January 31st of 2020 and then went right into the pandemic and things were crazy. So obviously, it's a bit difficult to evaluate just what was from the pandemic and what wasn't, which will lead to many indicts of evidence later. However, if you look to the graph on the right, you can see that when compared to G7 nations, basically the group of seven or powerful nations, this includes nations like the US and China, large superpowers, the UK lags significantly behind following Brexit. So if you look beforehand, the blue and red line follow pretty similarly, but then after Brexit, it falls off by a rating that is statistically significant. That's what that little shading is, and basically means that it is guaranteed that this is not due to just chance. This is due to real, some other factor. Furthermore, the last sort of thing I want to touch on here is what are called the rules or the retained EU laws. These are basically when the EU or when the UK left the EU, they put a bunch of laws on the book that were basically one-to-one copies of all the EU things. So if you remember, the Conservatives in the UKIP or the Tories were basically complaining that there was too much regulation. They wanted to get out. They didn't like migration issues. So, for all that talk, you would think that they would have pure independence from the EU, but that wasn't entirely the case. In fact, over 6,900 rules or retained EU laws are still on the books today. So basically, there's almost 7,000 laws that are one-to-one copies from the EU's playbook. So all those regulations are still applying to the UK. This was done to make sure that there was a consistency in how laws were enforced, but they haven't really been changed. So for right now, it basically means that the EU, for most, not most, but for many forms of regulations, is just part of the EU because they've retained all these laws. That gives you something interesting to think about in terms of, just many of the impacts that have happened and ways for you to look for things in the future. These sort of facts are really helpful in cross or as in ways that you might not realize, but will become very helpful. Alrighty. And before we go on to some arguments, I wanted to talk about some three areas that I felt were particularly a bit struggle areas that I've seen some of my novices have some issues with. So first off is the UK-centric framing. So of course, the resolution says that the United Kingdom should rejoin the European Union. That doesn't mean, though, that we only care about the UK. In fact, we should care about the entire world because whenever a judge is watching around, they're not the UK. They are just voting for that cost benefit analysis. Is it worth the risks to vote for the affirmative or the negative? Thus, you should try to avoid simply focusing on the UK. Now, of course, your arguments should be based on whether the UK joins or does not join. However, you should think of impacts and scenarios that involve the world. So, for example, you wouldn't want to say that if the UK joins, the UK economy would fall into shambles. Sure, that might be a bit of an issue, but what's a better thing to say is that joining would cause rippling effects across the world economy or the EU's economy, which is bigger than just the UK's. All of those things will make your back half, basically the rebuttals and the summary and the final focus, all easier because the weighing is so much easier to do. You can weigh the EU over the UK or the world over both of them because they're just bigger things to consider than just a UK-centric framing. Furthermore, I want to talk a little bit about immigration. So, of course, when dealing with the politics of the UK and the EU and what motivated Brexit, a lot of talk in political circles and for voters dealt with immigration. Now, that being said, I don't think that this is a compelling argument for or against in this debate. Individuals have very firm grasps of what they believe on the topic of immigration, and there isn't fully a tangible impact to whether or not immigration really affects a ton of things on the high extinction level impacts that many debaters are oftentimes arguing for. What that means is that you probably shouldn't be making arguments that are, for lack of a better word, a bit xenophobic in a sort. Try not to make arguments strictly against immigration just because they are immigrants. Try to evaluate what would occur if immigrants, for example, were entering the job market in the UK because they had greater access to movement. Maybe that would reduce the price of labor because there are more workers available for the labor market. That could be good for businesses because now there's cheaper wages and they are able to produce more product and they have higher productivity. This is not an emotional discussion, but a logical one. And if you are going to talk about immigration, I highly encourage you to try to attempt to take that sort of more logical, less emotional angle if possible. And lastly, I wanted to talk about sort of what actually happens if you vote for the affirmative. So, if you remember, there were a lot of UK opt-outs. There were some abilities that the UK didn't have to do certain regulations, which applied to large things like even cybersecurity or climate change regulations, all the way to economic policy and political enforcement, policing, all of those things. The UK had a ton of opt-out clauses. But if it rejoins, it probably won't. There's a few terms I have down here to help guide you in your research, but it's generally seen that if the UK were to restart its joining process, it would have to abide by the same policies that other EU joining members would have to do. And because it would no longer be considered as a founding member as it was when the EU started and got all those like big benefits towards the early era, it would be seen as, I mean, also, if you just think about it from a friends and a fun political perspective where the EU and the UK are just people, you wouldn't want your friend that leaves you and calls you terrible names and then like kicks you to then come back and ask for you to be all buddy buddy and a hug and everything. That's just not how it works. So it's probably likely to expect that the UK wouldn't get access to those opt-outs, which might give you even more ground because now you can say, well, the UK will be forced to be part of the euro. It will be forced to have the Schengen zone. It will be forced to be in the single market. It will have all those things, which gives you way more arguments to talk about. I hope everyone's having a great time. We're going to get on to some affirmative and negative arguments. Now, because this is a large topic, there are a ton of arguments that you can be making. So I chose just three sort of areas to give you some analysis for and against. But before we get into those examples of arguments that you might want to consider or that might provoke some thoughts, let's go back to the basics of what arguments are. Again, this is the first topic of the year, so I want to give some advice to all my novices. Most arguments in PF have three different layers to it: the uniqueness, the link, and the impact. The uniqueness is saying what is unique about the current situation right now. Typically, we're like, it's so bad, because if it's bad, then we need to change something. The link says what that change would be. What changes from the resolution? So that would be the rejoining to the EU by the UK. So what would that cause that would be different? The impact is the terminal endpoint of that change. So what does the change cause that is the reason we should care? So we're now going to go into some example arguments. The first area of analysis I have deals with economics. This is, of course, a classic area. Let's start with the affirmative. I'm going to try to explain a basic argument that would be for the economics of the affirmative. So we would say that right now, some form of the world is suffering economically. Things aren't going well. But if the UK rejoins the EU, then because it's the one market block, there wouldn't be taxes on trade, which means that goods could move in between them and there would be more competition. It would be just as affordable to have a UK good compared to a Spanish good based off of solely the taxes paid and taxes alone. So then people would buy what was cheaper. And so markets would move and be more efficient. That would make it such that prices would be lower. Then the impact of that would be to argue that having lower prices on things like food and medicine and maybe green technology would all prevent deaths, either immediately with food and medicine, or maybe in the long term by preventing climate change with green technology. All of those things are, that's pretty straightforward. The negative, on the other hand, would probably say that things are going well for the economy, but when you link economies together, it creates more economic risk. If you think about the reason that the '08 market recession was so bad and the reason that the COVID pandemic was so bad, largely that was because all of these economies were linked together, right? Shipping and trade really was what caused a lot of those supply chain collapses from the pandemic. And similarly, if the UK were to rejoin the EU, maybe it would have more coupling. It wouldn't be an independent nation in which it might be forced to produce its own goods. It might instead feel that it could rely on its neighbors. But if something happens, that risk could be really bad. Thus, you would say that a recession would not only take lives from things like poverty, but maybe it could start risking a global war, which might cause extinction as individual nations become scared over their resources and are forced to take on more extreme policy makes. Both of these arguments are really straightforward. So, what I would encourage you to do when you're coming up with what you actually want to be arguing in round is a more specific version of these arguments. These are just outlines. So, maybe instead of saying for the affirmative, just that the world is suffering economically, maybe you're going to talk about how housing prices are particularly bad, or how there's a specific form of the economy that's doing quite poorly, and why that's specifically tied to Brexit with compelling evidence. All of this makes your case far more compelling to vote for, and it also makes it less likely that your opponent has specific warrants or reasons to reject the arguments that you're making. Our second topic area deals with regulations. So the affirmative might be talking about how there's some issues with fighting climate change, but that the EU, which has all those regulations we talked about, those would be really good for another nation to have, like the UK. And by applying those regulations over to the UK, which would no longer get an opt-out, the UK would have better green tech development. And those sorts of technologies would be more efficient, they would be up to par, they would be safe and affordable to use, and that would make it such that climate change would be prevented, and that would solve for extinction. That's one argument you could be making for the affirmative. On the negative, though, you could make the opposite argument that right now there's no regulation, so certain companies, like medical companies, are doing great, but that EU regulations chill that medical development. I've seen some articles call it, quote, the chill pill, end quote, which is fun. But basically, it would slow down medical research, and without those sorts of medical technologies and medicine, more pandemics could occur, which cause extinction. If you've noticed, I've been referring to extinction a lot as an impact in this lecture, and that's really because that's the sort of thing that a lot of PFers feel that they should be making the terminalized impact of their argument. If you think about how to get to extinction, you can always get to more tangible and realistic impacts. Pandemics, if caused, would definitely kill thousands, if not millions of people. But you can only get to that form of understanding by finding the furthest extrapolation of that, like an extinction-based argument. And also, whenever you do weighing, extinction is always bigger on a magnitude front because it's just literally everyone. Those sorts of arguments might be really easy to weigh in the back half. Now, it might be harder on probability, but on a pure numbers point, it seems like a compelling argument. So that's just explaining why we're going to extinction on a lot of these arguments. Our last sort of novice starter argument deals with politics. So for the affirmative, you might say that geopolitics, basically politics as to who is in charge of what goes on in the world around the globe, are currently struggling to have a leader as the US is stepping away from things. So if you remember, USAID or US aid has been sort of cut substantially. The US has been moving away from the WHO and other large international organizations. So you could say that the EU, if the UK re-enters the EU, that would bolster its credibility. And in doing so, the EU would take that place as the hegemon. It would be the global superpower and the leader. And that, you could say, might be the best thing for global peacekeeping. Because while nations like the US might be provoked into a war because they feel so moved, right? Political leaders have moved into like the Vietnam War. We saw Afghanistan. And now it seems that a lot of political and military involvement by the US is a bit on a whim. Those sorts of moves might be prevented if you have a larger body like the EU, which has a lot of community-based governance, right? It's not just a single nation like Italy that's making decisions and wants to go to war. If Italy wants to go to war, it has to contend and convince many other nations and communities that all have their own way of life and culture and goals and all those things. Those sorts of things might make it best for peacekeeping, which could prevent having some large scale war break out and might be a stabilizing force on the world. For the negative, you might say that this is a different form of politics. So while the affirmative was making some multilateral, basically a multi-nation argument, the negative might make a more domestic politics argument and say that, well, the UK is doing great right now, but if the EU got back in, all those right-wing groups that voted for Brexit, the Conservatives or the Tories, and the UKIP party might get really upset. And then they might start winning, they might start getting into power and have the political capital, basically the ability to enact change through politics in the UK. And if the Tories got in, or if UKIP got into governance, you could say that that sort of coalition would be terrible for the UK. It might cause some sort of structural violence by enabling poverty to continue as Tories sort of conventionally perform cost-cutting measures that isolate members that are unable to find a job. It would make social services be put on the edge. And they might also feel that they should escalate the Russia-Ukraine war. Tories have a unique policy on how they deal with supporting Ukraine. And because they're so close to the war, oftentimes they feel that they kind of just want more trade to occur from it. There were strong ties to Russia with large or liquefied natural gas imports and having Russian oligarchs in the city of London, for example. So some of those conservative groups really want to side with Russia, and that might be a bad thing. You can make those sort of unique arguments. So yeah, these are all just some starter ideas as to how you can get thinking about the arguments of this topic. And I just want to encourage you to get creative and to think about all of those fun ways that this open topic would enable you to talk about an interest of the world that you find particularly compelling. Maybe you're really into climate change and you really care for that. Maybe you care about biodiversity. Even though both of those deal with the environment, they're both really different arguments at their core. One deals with animals and ecosystems, and the other one deals with mainly anthropological or human-made consequences and how we adapt our industrial processes. I'm going to leave you with a advanced form of that last argument we talked about, the politics argument. And I wanted to introduce the internal link to our novices. That's basically the step between the link to the impact. It's just another stepping stone to get along that path. And this is basically what I would say is a more specific version of these sorts of arguments I talked about that I might find particularly interesting, that I might feel compelled to run. So, on the affirmative, you could say that if you remember those nations such as the Scotland Independence Party and the parties in Northern Ireland, those sort of groups voted for Brexit. So you could say that right now they're not really winning elections, which is true. They don't have that much say in the UK's government, but that if the UK got back into the EU, that it would boost their own economy, which could validate their political momentum and allow those parties to get a ton of political support. It could make them the decision makers in those coalitions that could make calls on what politics get involved. And they might make the call to have independence. In doing so, that could resolve some of the structural violence that has been plaguing these sorts of nations. You could make an argument that Northern Ireland, which has a really long history, if you look into it, of sort of colonialism and religious conflict, particularly, and ethnic struggles, those sorts of issues might be resolved if they were able to have independence. And those sorts of generational long impacts are something that might be more tangible than a short-term economic strain, you might be able to argue, with some form of Wang. Furthermore, you could make a different argument for the negative that this is a version of a politics argument. I wanted to swap the two. So we had the domestic one and the multilateral one. This is a domestic argument, but for a different nation than the UK. I'm not going to say what specific one because there's a few ones that could fit in here. And so it could leave the door open. But you could say right now that the European Union is doing pretty well, but that if the UK re-enters, it could make other nations' political groups get really upset, giving them a lot of political capital and power. So if you think about how, you know, the UK made this big kerfuffle on the way going out the door. Remember, it's like the friend situation. Your friend leaves, calls you names, kicks you, all this stuff, and then tries to come back into the friend group. Well, if it got back into the friend group, that would imply a lot of decision makers in the EU were basically complicit in allowing that sort of re-entry policy, which could be seen as somewhat offensive to other nations that to go through bureaucratic hurdles and really have been upset by how the UK has handled this situation. And so the internal link is basically saying that, well, those nations' political groups, maybe they'll start feeling that, they want to reject the UK. Maybe they hate the UK, or maybe they just want to do some sort of retribution or some sort of, way back. And they elect sort of Eurosceptic leaders. The UK has less decision-making power because its leaders don't want to enact policies. It wants to just defer to local governments. And then without the EU making decisions, well, you're not going to be able to have those benefits from before of having peacekeeping, of having a multilateral hegemon, and all those benefits that might be able to prevent life-ending wars. So, yes, I think that both of these are just fun arguments. And again, it's just a mind activity to get you thinking about, well, what are those sort of more specific ways of talking and engaging with these arguments? And that's pretty much all I have. I thought that this topic is really going to be fun. I've seen some great debates so far, and I'm sure we're only going to see even more. If you have any questions, I'm available and you can find me. If you try, I'm sure I'm available online somewhere. And yeah, this is the details that Equality and Forensics wanted me to sort of leave here. They do a lot of great work and have been helpful in sort of making some online materials, especially if you've got friends doing Congress. They put out some really fun and great materials. And they also have a sort of community blog that puts out some interesting materials sometimes. Right. That's all for me. I hope you have a good rest of whatever time period you're living in. And yeah, have a great day.